Welcome everybody to this afternoon session. I'm very proud to present to you today our speaker, Shwetak Patel from Washington University in Seattle. This is a live talk, and this is a talk that comes before our hot topic session and addresses already health and technology. Shwetak Patel is a recipient of the 2018 ACM Prize in Computing. He's also Director of Health Technology at Google. He did fantastic work on ubiquitous computing, on sensing, and in particular, his interest is in making technology sustainable and available for affordable prices, for instance. And I'm really curious on listening to his talk. It's going to be a short talk, actually, as we said, meant to inspire our hot topic later on. So we have only 20 minutes for the talk. And we will have some time for question answering after the talk. So please put your questions that you have for Shwetak on the chat, and then we can ask Shwetak after the talk a few questions. And without further ado, I would hand over to Shwetak for his talk on learning from global health research to address the current pandemic. Shwetak, please.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. So welcome everyone from around the world. Obviously, this is a unique time right now. I'm actually presenting from my home in Seattle, Washington. So today what I want to do is just a short presentation on my thoughts around global health and some of the ways that global health is actually impacting the way we are approaching the pandemic. As Rainier said, this is a way to just kick off the hot topic sessions today. A lot of, I think, the interesting conversations will come out in the panel sessions and the Q&A session. So, but I just wanted to just provide a few words in terms of how I think about this space. So this is an interesting topic area, global health. Just last year, we had hot topics that were in climate change and sustainability. And then I had proposed last year to some of the organizers, hey, let's do something in global health. Little did I know would we be in a worldwide pandemic. There are very few things in society where it cuts across every single individual in the world. Climate change and sustainability is one of those, which we talked about last year. And this year, little did we know that we would have a pandemic that would touch every single life in the world. And so these are some really interesting and challenging times for us, and hopefully the young researchers out there will be able to get some inspiration and learn about what are some of the kinds of things they can do to have an impact here. But what I want to focus on is just reflecting on the work that researchers have done in global health and how is it applying here. If you think about innovations in healthcare, there's all these defining moments, and for me, the current pandemic that we're in we're going to be in a place where we're going to really see how we're going to define healthcare. We're in an amazing defining moment situation right now where if you think about everything that we've done in healthcare, if you think about the things that we've been trying to push the envelope with in terms of innovations in healthcare, a lot of those things are either being accelerated or the walls or the barriers have started to become reduced so that we can start to do some of these things that we had thought about years ago now. And it's going to be very fascinating what comes out of the other end of it, but this is a very unique time. And in healthcare, a lot of times it's pandemics that actually spurs innovation. So if you think about innovations in vaccines and drugs, typically when you have some of these types of epidemics or pandemics happening, that's when you have critical mass of people joining. I mean, right now, if you think about almost every researcher in the world has their eye on the coronavirus or COVID. And very rarely do you see a significant number of researchers putting that much attention on a single problem. If you look about innovations in HIV, for example, for therapeutics, these are things that took a while, but it was really galvanizing the resources and the research around those areas that really started to address some of the issues around HIV. Or if you look at some of the modern paradigm shifts that we're seeing, which is AI, artificial intelligence is really changing the game in terms of how we do screening and diagnostics, looking at how do we augment a clinician or an expert with AI technologies to help overread X-rays or radiology scans and those kinds of things. So these paradigm shifts is how we operate in healthcare, and this pandemic is no small paradigm shift, and we're going to really see what's going to happen during and as the course of this pandemic moves forward. The other areas of paradigm shift, if you can think about, point to, are things like point of care diagnostics, which revolutionized healthcare in terms of not having to wait to get a result back from a diagnostics or a screen. The moment that you're in that particular clinical setting, you can start to get a result back. It could be things like ultrasound, looking at ultrasound readings at the moment that you're being taken care of. Or looking at innovations now where you think about mobile phones and mobile health, devices that are connected to your phone. Right now, if you think about the 5 billion phones in the world, there's almost a phone for every individual in the world. And the phone is actually the centroid for computing technology for most of the world, even for low and middle income countries. LMIC countries have this notion of mobile that's expanding. And an area that I talked about last year, that's near and dear to me, is looking at how do we leverage sensors that are already on phones for screening and diagnosis. Things like using the microphone for respiratory and pulmonary assessment, using the camera for neonatal jaundice or hemoglobin or heart rate monitoring, looking at how do we use the accelerometer and gyro for osteoporosis. There's an incredible amount of work you can do with the confluence of AI and sensors that are becoming more and more ubiquitous on a mobile phone. And the affinity that people have to a phone has a great opportunity where you can leverage that platform for healthcare. And so all these innovations in computing can really instigate change. But for me, computing is not just the reason why we're going to actually innovate in healthcare. I think it's a scalar. I think it's a way to instigate new change. It's a way to try out new ideas. But I think there's a confluence of a lot of different factors that come together if we want to innovate in healthcare. And so what I wanted to just outline were just 4 areas that I found interesting in looking at how the global health research communities and a lot of the things that we've done there, how it's being applied or can be applied in the current pandemic. People often tell me, it's like, oh, we're in a very unique pandemic. Yes, we are. Yet we are in a unique pandemic, and we were never prepared. Well, there's some countries that may not have been prepared over others, but if you think about the fundamental research, there's a lot of things that the global health research communities had been doing that is actually being borrowed or implicitly being used right now, that we were kind of ready for some of these aspects of it. Maybe the way it came together might not have been effective, but looking at how that some of these things were already being explored in LMIC environments, or looking at just global health in general. And this is not talking about vaccines. So vaccines obviously is an area that we need to innovate on, and we are innovating on, but these are some other areas that may not have always come to mind. And these are areas of workforce capacity. Right now we have a health workforce crisis in terms of people helping treat, manage, diagnose, screen individuals with coronavirus or suspected COVID. Public health data, testing. How do we think about testing at a massive scale? And then follow-up. After you've been diagnosed with coronavirus, what do you do next? Now we have a significant portion of the world's population that might be infected. Well, what about after they're no longer symptomatic? So these are things that there's been a lot of research in the global health community that have impacted people that are thinking about tuberculosis or other pulmonary diseases out there. So if you think about the first area, I just want to quickly go through some of these, is that enabling frontline workers is one of the critical areas right now. If you think about the number of people being infected and people trying to seek care, our healthcare systems in many parts of the world just can't handle this volume. And so if you think about this, this is analogous to the frontline workers and the community health workers that global health researchers have been trying to enable for years, even decades. Looking at technology like ComCare that Damagi's been doing, or a number of other NGOs that are building tools to help community health workers more efficiently manage the care of 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 individuals. So how do you provide a mechanism to match the needs of that particular community with the healthcare system? Community healthcare workers provide that gap. And in a way, in a lot of the more developed countries, we're starting to see some of this happening already. The frontline workers that are, or the triage nurses that are put in place to help manage the care and the treatment and the testing for individuals. Some of the work that we've done in the past, we've looked at mobile as a way to collect data, and the bottom left-hand side of the screen is an example in Bangladesh where we did a massive project around looking at how do we use mobile for enabling pulmonary healthcare workers, so community health workers there in the pulmonary space, to address these issues in Bangladesh. And even looking at some of the work that Google and Apple are doing now, where collaborating to create contact tracing tools, or at least mechanisms to make it easier for community health workers to be able to identify who may be infected so they can get ahead of it. But there's a lot of innovations here that I think that we often take for granted that is starting to be borrowed. The other area is public health data and response. I mean, one of the challenges right now is where do we put our resources? What do we put our attention? Are the things that we've implemented even working? So if you think about IHME, so IHME is the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. This is an organization that's partially also funded by the Gates Foundation that has done incredible work worldwide to look at to capture the data and provide and inform and provide information about where to put the resources and what are the public health trends that are happening. A lot of the work that IHME has done in the global health space is now pivoted to supporting some of the COVID-19 response work, or looking at forecasting, looking at how things are trending. But even if you look at some of the things from technology companies like Google, so Google has really been looking at how do we leverage some of the privacy preserved data in terms of movement or mobility data to see if we can glean information about what's happening with the population. So for example, when some of these shelter in place orders or these social distancing protocols or mechanisms were instituted in many parts of the world, even in the US, you could see if people are actually complying. Where were people going? Are they going still to retail? Are they still shopping? You know, looking at from a community level standpoint, from a county standpoint, to see what things are working in certain regions and why are they not working. So being able to bring this data together to inform where we want to push our precious resources is something that we've borrowed from the global health community, and these are things that we're also implementing right now as a community now. The other area is testing. Testing is something that everybody struggles with in terms of what's the effective way of doing testing. Where do we get people tested? One of the things that is being developed as we speak are ways to do in-home testing. So how do you get people tested at home? How do you think about rapid diagnostic testing? Right now, most of the testing is PCR based. So typically you do a nasal swab and then you PCR the nasal swab itself. But if you think about that, you can do that really effectively in a clinical setting, but how do you do that effectively at home? There's been projects where people have been receiving kits remotely. Maybe they get it at home, they do the test and send it back. The problem is, how do you do that effectively? People aren't used to doing these nasal swabs or some of these tests. So if you think about some of the work in the global health space, and this is work that some of my grad students have done, is looking at how do we build tools to make it easier and more effective to interpret rapid diagnostic tests. So here is an example of an RDT for malaria. You might often think as, oh, it looks kind of like a pregnancy test or any lateral flow assay where you look at the color changes, but it's not always that easy. There's still a need for an objective measure to know that, hey, is that a positive or negative test? And on top of that, the test is only as good as how good the sample is. Did you do the sampling right? Did you actually put enough buffer in it? So there's the mechanisms on making these rapid diagnostic tests more effective can also cross over and is crossing over to COVID and coronavirus testing. So in-home testing by community health workers, or even testing facilities that might have to have these process controls in place that is also starting to be leveraged. The other thing one of the things that we did a few years ago was in Peru, there was this epidemic where 60% of the adolescent population was anemic. The anemia epidemic, and it's still impacting Peru right now. A lot of it's because of food quality, nutrition, water quality, and those kinds of things. There, we actually developed a tool that leveraged some of our hemoglobin work to see how can we do large-scale screening and testing by empowering community health workers to do this in their communities so that the precious resources can be directed in the right ratios to the different regions. And so these are things that have already we've thought about in the global health sector that can be and will be useful as we think about the global pandemic for the coronavirus at the moment. And then finally, I want to talk about follow-up. And what I mean by follow-up is that it's not just a matter of talking about how individuals are treated or tested, but what happens afterwards. So if you think about the coronavirus, we don't really know what the secondary impacts of coronavirus really are. What are the impacts? And if, for example, if you have been infected, are you more susceptible to a secondary infection, a pulmonary infection? Are you more likely to have an exacerbation? The question really is that it's not just testing and treating somebody, but it's following up with them. What happens afterwards? There's work that we did related to this in tuberculosis. So we worked really closely with the Gates Foundation for years to look at, if you had an individual that is that has been diagnosed with active TB and you've given them the triple cocktail, they're at home, that's a 6 to 9 month treatment. How do we make sure that the treatment's actually going well and that they're actually going to follow up? And really it's difficult from a low and middle income community standpoint where the follow-up is very tough. So we started to build technology with the foundation where we use things like simple phones or things that they might already have with them to do things like cough monitoring. If their cough is not getting better, that's probably an indicator that something is not going well, or if the cough gets worse, or what are some other signals like their respiratory rate, that is it improving or not? So these are things that you can take back home to the village or to their home to see how they're doing so that they can come back, or there is a way to maybe change that regimen or that particular treatment. But scaling that is really difficult where an individual can't manage every single person. So we looked at a lot of those innovations around AI and looking at audio processing to be able to do this in TB. We've been working in this space for a long time now. And it turned out that if you think about for coronavirus and COVID, which is a pulmonary disease, some of the work in the respiratory and cough world actually applies in COVID and coronavirus. So in addition to looking at some of our cough research for tuberculosis, we've applied a lot of this work to coronavirus. In fact, a significant amount of the research community is trying to focus on cough. And so an area that my grad students have looked at is applying some of the cough monitoring work for COVID. So looking at how departments of health or regional community health workers or looking at hospital systems can leverage some simple things as just cough monitoring or just the cough frequency, maybe in the evening or throughout the day, or maybe just sporadically monitoring that to see if you're doing better or not. Or even trying to detect that if there could be an exacerbation post-COVID, that you might have a complication after you've been treated, or somebody that's at risk, looking at this as a signal or as a factor to see something might be happening. So this is another area that if we need a scale to post-treatment or post follow-up, this is another area that technology could play a role that's actually been borrowed from the tuberculosis or the TB space, or even studying the spread of the disease. If you think about tuberculosis, the spread of the disease is still a little unknown. We still don't know how the disease is aerosolized, how the particles or the particulates are actually suspended in the air that infect somebody. I mean, these are the questions that we created models around and technology around, where those kinds of things are still being investigated right now with the coronavirus to figure out how it spreads. So there is a lot of work in the fundamentals, in the science space, fundamental research space for TB that can be applied and is being applied. So in closing, I just wanted to kind of inspire the students that are listening right now to think about, we're in a really unique paradigm shift right now in healthcare. One of the paradigm shifts right now, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be in a defining moment in terms of how the world grapples with healthcare. If you think about research in low and middle income countries, or if you look at more developed countries, right now the playing field is a bit level, in the sense that the pandemic is having equal impact across the world. In fact, a lot of the more what we call developed countries are being impacted in ways that a lot of low and middle income countries have also been impacted in terms of the scaling of community health workers, looking at how do we do treatment and how do we actually take a data-driven approach. And some of that work can also be applied in more of a global sense. The other thing is that, computing technology is emerging at a rapid pace. And now it's really going to be how we bring these pieces together, because one AI algorithm is not going to solve global health or the healthcare problem or the pandemic, but it's really harnessing that as a scaler and an instigator for positive change, in the sense that it allows us to innovate in novel ways, but it's really got to bring together public policy, public health, and technology. All that has to come together with health innovation. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's this new way to think about global health. It's not just global health, and when you think about LMIC, it's global health. It's actually global. It's not a one country versus another country. It's all of us being impacted in some way. And for the young researchers out there, it's your time to have an impact. We're in a very unique situation right now that, if you look at the confluence of climate change and this pandemic, there are a lot of things that you young researchers should have the ability to have this positive impact. And I encourage you to break through your silos, break through the standard norms of your field to try to collaborate across fields to try to see if you can have an impact in this space. Often in research, we often think about our particular dogma or particular philosophies or our particular community, and we have to innovate within our community. At this point, there are no boundaries here. We have to work together, and I encourage all of you to think about how you can work across these disciplines to be able to have this positive impact that we're looking for towards you, the next generation researchers and the young researchers that are in has an amazing opportunity with the tools that are now available for you to have this positive impact. So thank you. I will end it there, and I'll take questions, but thank you for your attention.
Shwetak, thank you so much. I think I'm online now again. We had quite some questions actually in the discussion already, and I think this was a wonderful and stimulating talk. I would like to start with the first two questions and bring them together in a way. Arun Skandaraya and Narinder Pun asked maybe in a similar direction questions. And the question is about what happens like after the pandemic. So the one question is, what is if we lost focus about COVID and where do we go beyond? How do we mitigate the damage to other important health issues? And the other question was how AI is helping to tackle this pandemic. What are its possibilities in the post-COVID-19 world?
Yeah, no, these are all great questions. I mean, I'll address the post-COVID world. Yeah, Arun, that's a great question. One of the things that we have to be really careful with is that are we over pivoting, so to speak, in the sense that right now, we're in this pandemic, this crisis, and it's essentially all hands on deck. But one of the things that we have to think about is, the pandemic is a time slice right now that we're trying to address. But over optimizing and not generalizing enough, I think could have these secondary impacts. So one of the things that we have to actually be careful with as a community is if you think about the people that are at most risk, that may have a comorbidity or have a secondary condition, are the ones that are most impacted. So if we're not able to help them with their primary either conditions or what things that they might be struggling with now, it might actually have this unintended consequence that we haven't been able to look at the broader impact of what COVID is doing or some of the other conditions that we need to focus on. The other thing is that we need to, as a community, to keep the momentum going. We've from the regulatory standpoint, worldwide, there's these opportunities to rapidly try things out, telemedicine, remote monitoring, looking at how do we innovate in this space. Everything has changed. But the other thing as a community is that we have to keep that momentum going as well. So it's not just a one-time thing. How do we demonstrate as a community that these things that have been, these opportunities have been opened up for us, that it has actually led to a positive outcome? We have to capture those and basically demonstrate how that actually enabled what's happening here. It's not just the fact that there was a pandemic, it was that the things that came out of that, we need to capture those and be able to generalize that. In terms of AI, I think there's a couple of different places I alluded to. One was some of the audio work that's being done worldwide for respiratory monitoring, cough monitoring, those kinds of things. Looking at signals, pre-signals, pre-symptomatic signals, post-COVID. There's been work in chest x-rays. So if chest x-rays could actually show something, so there's AI algorithms that can overread radiology reports, those kinds of things. There's also all the modeling work. So looking at both vaccine modeling, looking at population health modeling, looking at the RNA vaccine that's being developed. So data science and AI algorithms trying to help modeling and prediction for those kinds of things as well. So I think AI has gotten to a point where it's just in the background, where it's kind of the secret sauce of computing still. But those are just some examples there.
Thank you very much for this answer. And Anne Ross goes with her question into sort of another direction, asking also on negative effects that could be potentially involved. And she wants to know your thoughts on the interaction between global health and disability accessibility. And she says, while healthcare can be essential for managing conditions, healthcare can also have negative effects and problematic biases and approaches like difficult approaches to disability or disabled communities. So how can innovations in global health research avoid or address the negative components of healthcare for people with disabilities?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Often when you think about innovating in the healthcare space, one of the things that you want to avoid against, and this is something that I talk to my teams about, talk to my grad students about, and just in general, is looking at the thing that we're building can't create a bigger health disparity, right? And that's a fundamental principle that we have to think about. If you develop a technology, and this is kind of going to one of the other questions, is around convincing people that the technology is even helpful, is around looking at, if the technology only impacts a very small portion of the population, you create this bigger disparity. Often, if you look at a single slice or a single part of the problem, you are also alienating a significant portion of the community. If you look at, healthcare is just a disease or chronic disease from a standpoint, you're also not thinking broadly about mental health, looking at other opportunities for disabilities or things that go beyond just the conventional definition of healthcare. And I think what global health allows us to do is bring in that kind of broad perspective of how communities think about healthcare, the impact of a particular environment on one's health. So I think the kinds of questions that we can ask can be informed from a global health kind of mindset. But that's a very great point. And it's a tough one that we have to create some principles around, where you can't create a bigger disparity from the development of the technology, which unfortunately happens a lot right now.
And the next question by Sergio Aguilar is actually pretty much one I would have asked myself as well. He asks, what are the main ethical challenges of large-scale processing of health data, particularly genetic data in the context of personalized medicine? And also, if you take like companies like Google or like big players that might be players then also in healthcare and collect all this data about employees, relatives, etc.
Right.
So what is like the challenge, or how can we deal with the challenge that this data is secure, safe, and not used for any negative things?
That's right. No, that's a great question. Personal security and privacy is paramount, and one of the things that we have to really think about as researchers is looking at, one is what data are we collecting, and not necessarily collecting data for the sake of data. Right. That often, when I talk to students about, hey, I'm just going to collect this data and then figure out later what I'm going to do with it. And that's not how we should approach this. We should still take a fundamental hypothesis-driven approach where, hey, there's a rational approach in terms of why this particular data is valuable and important for this particular outcome. So one is actually proving outcome. So does that data actually do what we think it does? So being able to get the trust of the community and the users that would benefit from this, to prove that data actually does that. Secondly is doing kind of an assessment to see, does the value that it brings outweigh the privacy concerns that it might bring? If I'm consenting my personal health data or my sensor data, does the value that I get as an individual in terms of the safety and the well-being of my family and myself outweigh what I have consented to? Is one of the first things that we have to think about. The other thing is transparency. It's got to be very clear what happens with the data. Where does it go? If I allow an individual or a set of researchers to use the data, or a company, I really need to be able to know what's going on with the data and have that transparency. I think that's the way that we can do this, because a lot of times if it goes into a black box, it's really hard to know or even convince an individual that they actually have that control over their data. But being able to give them the knobs and the levers, but also do it in a way that they can actually understand it, is the other one. So this is a very tricky situation in the sense that, data is captured in many different ways beyond just healthcare data. If you think about non-health data, there's just so many different sources of data. And so how do we add a knob or add mechanisms for individuals to think about the healthcare data? Makes it very tricky, because you have all these other sources that people have to think about as well. But I think the transparency and making it easy to access and be able to opt out is going to be really critical. But for me, the fundamental question is really, what data and what is the minimum set of data that you need to have that positive impact?
Thank you so much. I'm really sorry, Shwetak, but I think we have to close here. Time is over already, and we have quite a number of other interesting questions which I would have loved to discuss with you. However, maybe in the panel or also over the meeting, we have some more time.
Yeah, so, and that was the goal. So we have a couple panels coming up. These questions are awesome questions, and I'd love to talk about these questions live. So please bring these up again in the panel, the VR session. There are a lot of opportunities to talk about this, but the whole goal was to spur questions.
So stay tuned, use the chance of the live interaction also here at HLF, and communicate also among each other. So use the VR tool to talk to each other. And now we close this presentation, and now you have to move over either to Zoom or you go into the VR room. And there we have the panel. I think people are setting up the stage already, and you can just move there. So you have to leave to the next session and then click on the Zoom link, or you go into the VR session. Shwetak, so many thanks for you. See you later again. And thanks for the talk. Virtual applause from all over the globe.
No, thank you. And thank you. And I just miss everybody. I mean, the two pictures you see here were from last year, but I wish we could all be there at HLF in Heidelberg, but we got to do our best virtually. But thanks to everyone for your attention. Hope to see some of you in person maybe next year.
Next year, hopefully all together in Heidelberg. Thank you.
Yeah, bye.